Shalom and greetings, friends. Thank you for clicking on this video teaching titled The Circumcision, Schism. And most of my viewers, you probably know what physical circumcision is, but schism, what does schism mean? It's a more uncommon word that's utilized in our modern societies today, English-speaking societies, unless we study theology and get to higher levels of theology or research history. So let me define the word schism for those of you out there who may not be sure of what I mean by that. A schism, it is a late Latin word, a Vulgate Latin word, and it simply means it can mean a split or to split or a division. And a schism is used in modern English that means a separation or division of factions, a formal breach of union within a Christian church is how it's commonly used. The offense of attempting to produce such a breach or union, or a disunion is another way of wording a schism, or discord, or causing discord or division. Now, schism can also be referred to in any breach or break or division into two separate factions. Doesn't have to be Christianity, but an example of a schism, we see the Great Schism. There's two great schisms in Christianity. We see in the 11th century where Eastern and Western Europe, where Catholicism was splitting into more of an Eastern and Western Europe, and different popes coming up and even going against each other. And then we have the Protestant Reformation later on, and even into the 13th, 14th centuries, we see protesters of Catholic Church. We see Martin Luther and many others coming later on. And so that is another great schism that has happened. But in this teaching, I'm not referring to anything like that, of course. It's the circumcision schism. And just the doctrine or the teachings of circumcision, physical circumcision, spiritual circumcision, and the differences in theology and understanding of this has caused a lot of division, a lot of unnecessary division. Now, in the King James Version, the Old King James, or the New King James, we only find the word schism once. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25. And it says that, and this is the Apostle Shaul, or many of you know him as Paul. It says here that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another. And he continues on there, that there shouldn't be any schism. And so the schism that I'm referring to in this message is between Jews and Gentiles. And it goes back to this first century in the teachings, and we're going to have to go into the Brit Hadashah. But I'm going to show you, before we get into this, we need to understand the differences between the written law, or the letter of the law, as some people say, of the books of Moses, or Moshe, his Hebrew word, his name. And then we have the oral law, or the oral commandments, the law, the teachings. Torah simply means instructions or teachings. And when we refer to scriptures, we believe that they come from the Creator, and they were inspired. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, even among the Pharisees and the Sadducees and even the scribes of the first century, there was the oral law, as we refer to it as today. It simply hadn't been written down yet, but the rabbinical leaders believed sincerely that these were oral commandments that were given to Moses, given to Moshe, but they just weren't written down. We don't see them in his 5 books there. And so that they were just handed down from generation to generation, and that they are equal or even higher authority than the written law or Torah scriptures of Moshe because they believed that they were expounded upon and explained in more detail. And but this is where many of us differ and disagree in the schism between, say, the Hebrew writings of the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, where Yeshua, the Messiah, many of you refer to his Greek name, Jesus, that the Greeks changed his name to, and also Shaul, Paul. They taught according to the written law, but they did teach against the oral commandments, the commandments of men that were added to the Torah or contradictory to the Torah, or just simply put as a higher priority, that are not explicitly in the Torah. So we need to understand that. If we were going to go in to understand Paul's writings, Shaul, we need to understand the difference between the oral and the written Torah, because he did not teach against the written laws or commandments of our Creator that Moshe wrote down for us, and neither did the Messiah. And I pointed that out. If you go to my video teachings titled, Who Are the Judaizers?, I give many scriptures to prove, to show that. But just jumping forward here to go into explaining the commandments of men verses, I'll just give one scripture here of Shaul, or in Titus chapter 1 verse 14. It says, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. So these are commandments of men, not commandments of our Creator, but these are commandments of men, and in fables and stories. Some of you have studied from the Kabbalah, and I've even had Orthodox and ex-Orthodox Jewish believers explain to me some of the Kabbalah and the stories, and even in deep into it, and some of it implies that even stories in the Tanakh are just good moral stories. Didn't really actually happen, and but they're good lessons to learn from. And we see a lot of Christianity, even atheism, you find that teaching that kind of goes around, and they're just fables, they're stories. But we need to believe our scriptures, that they are true, they were inspired. It's a book of history, a book of prophecy, a book of revelation, a book of peace, to show you how to love Him, how to love each other, and those two great commandments, how to love Him first, and then secondly to love our fellow human beings. The whole law and the Torah were based, the written law and Torah. But mankind likes to add. And in Joshua, we're told in two different places, be careful. We need to be careful not to add and not to take away from these scriptures. And so an example, let me give an example of an oral law versus a written law. In the book of Moshe, we see in Exodus 23:19 about not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. You know, say a kid, but a kid is not, it's talking about our children, but a baby goat, don't boil it in the mother's milk. We see it again in Exodus, or Shemot, 34:26. And then in Deuteronomy, or Devarim, 14:21. So here we see three examples, and the wording isn't different. It doesn't say anything about mixing meat with dairy specifically, but here's where the oral law comes in. In an Orthodox, strict Orthodox Judaism, they say you cannot even have dairy and meat in the same kitchen, or in the same refrigerator maybe, or even especially within the same meal of the person that's eating it, because it's not supposed to be ingested at the same time. And so that's an oral law that Orthodox Judaism says that, well, it's based upon, and it's expounding and magnifying the book of Moses here. But we look at Moses, he says, first of all, it says a goat. It doesn't say anything about cows or any other clean animals that are okay to eat, but it says a goat. And then secondly, it talks about boiling boiling, or we could say cooking, high temperature cooking or boiling. And thirdly, it's with the specific baby of that goat, not some other goat's, kids or anything like that. So there's three things there we see that are very specific. And we should, as we look deeper into the Torah, we see a lot of commandments that our Creator shows that He cares about the ecology, the environment. He says with birds, don't kill a clean bird if it's got babies in the nest. And He cares about those babies. He cares about His creation. He tells us to be good stewards of the creation. So we need to be careful, as I said, not to add commandments and judge others or cause divisions or schisms because of oral laws that are not explicit. Now, it does say not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. And we should not teach against that. But again, if someone feels obligated that they need to build this fence, we got the Torah, the written Torah, build a big fence of commandments so that we don't even come close to breaking those literal ones. If someone feels obligated to do that, well then, whatever is not of your conscience, if you go against your conscience, you're still sinning. You are defiling your conscience, and then when it comes to real commandments, you will defile that as well. So we need to be careful we're not defiling our conscience. We don't want to cause people to stumble over these issues, and even circumcision as we get into this. We shouldn't cause divisions or schisms. But, we need to understand the difference between the oral law and the written law. And that's where Moshe, taught, the Abrahamic covenants and also the covenants with Israel. But we need to realize that Shaul taught that. And how did he teach circumcision based upon that? We're going to get to that. And as another example of the letter of the law, we're told also to not, when we have to use the restroom, to dig a hole and then cover it with dirt when we're done, the fecal matter. Well, how many of you go into your backyards and do that, or outside and do that? We don't see much of that in Orthodox Judaism either. So we have to see what is the intent. What is the Creator's intent there? He says there's bacteria, there are germs, there are going to be diseases. So some laws are health laws for us to observe. And so we are following the principle. We flush it into the ground. It goes into septic tanks or areas where it can decompose and the environment can decompose it. And in the right ways, it can become fertilizer too. So we need to realize that if we just stick to the letter of the law alone, we can make things ultra strict, so strict that it becomes a yoke, a bondage to us that our Creator never intended. And so when the Pharisees were accusing our Messiah of breaking the Shabbats, he wasn't breaking them. He was breaking the oral laws, the commandments that they had come up with, but not the written law. And he pointed out even when an ox falls in the ditch, even if when David was eating the showbread, the holy bread, he shows that even picking in the field, his disciples weren't earning a living. They weren't making money out of it. They were hungry. Kind of like going to your refrigerator and taking out some food. They were traveling. They were doing the work. The priests were, the ministry, even in the temples, they were working the hardest, the most on the Shabbats than any other day of the week. So it's not the act of physical labor if you're doing a ministerial service or going to a congregation or a synagogue to preach. Oxes fall in the ditches, you might get a flat tire, you might have a problem. But, there's oral laws that become so strict that you can't even turn on a light switch because it says don't kindle a fire. So we see certain laws were for that time that were difficult to light a fire, but it's not difficult to turn on a light switch. Or turn on your car. There's spark plugs, and so they say little fires, little combustions are going on. But so we have to be careful. We're not adding to the Torah. We need to look to the Creator's intent. This is where we need the Spirit to understand how to keep it. For example, if you're unclean, if you're considered unclean till sunset according to the written law, well, does that mean you need to quarantine yourself? You touch a dead animal and you need to quarantine yourself from everybody because you've washed, you've cleansed from that, from touching the bad bacteria, or you're unclean in any physical way until sunset, or for that particular day or a couple days more. Do you have to quarantine yourself or just cleanse yourself? And there are certain ceremonial laws. You can't go to the tabernacle. You can't go to the temple. You can't offer a sacrifice, when you're ceremonially unclean. Doesn't mean being ceremonially unclean doesn't mean you have to quarantine yourself and you're too unclean to fellowship with people, to pray with people, to get together with people. And so we don't have the Shekinah glory return to this earth other than we have the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, we have angels, ministering spirits, but we don't have that literal return of what the Israelites had in that tabernacle. We have access to that in prayer and in relationship, but our Messiah has not come back yet literally. The third temple has not been built literally. We are the temple, yes, figuratively, and we are stones building up a royal priesthood and a temple. So there's analogies, there's metaphors and allegories. We need to understand the Hebraic mindset. But we also need to realize that when he literally comes to this earth, he does have expectations. We're going to get to that in Ezekiel 44, even in regard to circumcision. But in terms of a human life, in this human planet, and where we're at now, we need to be real careful. We are not doing away with this, but not also adding oral, rabbinical, ultra-strict commandments that are not really there. We need to understand what they were applied to, why they were applied, what is the Creator, how does it show us how to love Him, how does it show us how to love each other and get the gospel out better and more faithfully. So, getting to circumcision here, or the fact that the Apostle Paul didn't teach against the written Torah. Let's go to Acts chapter 24. In Acts 24, he's dragged into court, the Roman court system. Felix the governor is judging the case because here the rabbinical leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees as well, were trying to put Paul to death. He was a traitor. He was one of their high-ranking leaders, and all of a sudden he turns against them in their eyes because he accepts the Messiah. And so here they're trying to put him to death through the Roman court system legally. And this is what Paul's defense. This is what he says in verse 14 of Acts chapter 24. But this I confess to you, according to the way which they call a sect or a cult, so I worship the God of my fathers. Now he was a Benjamite. He was a Hebrew of the Hebrews in the Sanhedrin, and a high-ranking leader previous to his calling to accept Messiah. He says, I worship the same Creator of my fathers, the Hebrews, believing all things, not most things or some things, but all things, that which were written in the Torah, or the law, as it says in most English translations. But again, law is referring, Torah is referring to instructions, and the prophets. Not only the instructions of the 5 books of Moshe, but also all the prophets. Paul believed and taught according to that, and even circumcision. And we need to understand that. If you want more scriptures like this, please go to my video teachings, Who Are the Judaizers? But I want to go forward with, how did he teach circumcision? Let's go to Acts chapter 17. Let's go back a little bit here. And beginning in verse 10, it says, Then the brethren immediately sent Shaul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews, the Jewish people. Now he's preaching to the Jewish people, the rabbinical people, and whatever Gentiles were there, of course. These were more fair-minded, or more noble, than those in Thessalonica. Now, how were they more noble? How were they more fair-minded? In that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily. I mean, they didn't just believe him emotionally because he was a charismatic preacher out there. They searched the scriptures. They checked up on him. And I want you to check up on me as I go through this teaching on the circumcision schism. They searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. And of course, there's no doubt he taught about the Messiah and how he fulfilled the prophecies of the scriptures, and also circumcision, as we'll see. They didn't have his letters back then to the Romans or to the Galatians and to the Ephesians. Those were letters that he wrote to those congregations, but they weren't shared and passed around and copied and duplicated for a long time. So these Jewish people in Berea, in the synagogues there, all they had was the Torah and the Tanakh, as we say, which includes all the writings and the prophets, and as well as the writings of Moshe. So how did Paul teach? Let's go to the Torah. Let's go to his instructions, and let's go to that. And before I do, let me also cover Acts 15 briefly, because this is where the Christians today see we don't have to keep these commandments other than what's given to the Gentiles here in Acts chapter 15. But let's understand this. Again, we have to understand the written law, the Torah of Moses, and the oral, which they were also believing came from Moshe. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moshe, the laws, you cannot be saved. So here is saying you cannot receive salvation as a human being. You cannot unless you are physically circumcised. And so this is what I propose to you. That part of it, that tail end of verse 1, is coming from an oral law that they believe, that they've expounded upon from the written Torah, that they believe was handed down, and that you cannot be saved as a human, receive salvation, eternal salvation as a gift, unless you are circumcised physically. And so that's what I propose. Let's continue here. Therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension, no small disagreement, disputing with them. Jumping down to verse 5. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed, these were Pharisees who had come to accept Messiah, who became true believers in the Messiah, who was crucified in that century, around 30 A.D., on the Pesach day, the 14th day of the first month, according to the Creator's calendar. They rose up and they believed, saying, it is necessary to circumcise these Gentiles and command them to keep the law of Moses. Now again, it doesn't say the whole law, the whole written law, the letter of the law, but it's referring also to the oral law and what they were teaching on that they had to be circumcised based from the written law, of course, but teaching that salvation only came through by that to humans, and they couldn't receive it beforehand. So we can go back to the Torah. We can see that foreigners and uncircumcised people were allowed to be part of Israel and even live, not just as servants or slaves, but live among them. They weren't allowed to keep the Passover or the Pesach lamb, and they couldn't do the ceremonial aspects of that while uncircumcised. But we don't do that today. There's no temple to do that, and we don't do that whether you're Orthodox Jewish people today or whether you're believers, Messianic, Christian, Hebrew roots. We do more of a Seder. We do more of, many of us follow the example of Messiah with the foot washing and the bread and the wine, and along with the Seder as well, which is good. But we need to understand, let's be careful about how we teach this topic of circumcision and not cause division by trying to force Gentiles to be physically circumcised. And on the other hand, we can't be like mainstream Christians and put people down who want to be physically circumcised, because we're going to see Paul teaches that physical circumcision is profitable. It is beneficial. It does offer birthright promises. But in terms of eternal salvation, we need to be careful here. And Acts 15 is not talking about the whole law of Moshe, all the commandments. And as bona fide proof of that, and please don't get offended if you're offended by me saying that, because they're given 4 commandments here, in verse 19 and 20, that they should abstain from things polluted to idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. Well, Gentiles will say, well, that means I don't have to keep the Sabbaths. I don't have to keep the Shabbats or the Moedims because it's not commanded here in Acts chapter 15. That 4th commandment of the 10 is not mentioned here in Acts chapter 14. The 7th one is, and the 2nd one is. But you know what? We don't see the 6th commandment listed there, thou shalt not murder. Is it okay to be a serial killer? Because it's not, if you're a Gentile, and it's not mentioned there about murder in Acts chapter 15, or lying, or stealing, or coveting, or taking our Creator's name in vain. So that is bona fide proof. If you think it's okay to just break those commandments and as a Gentile, well, then you're misunderstanding Acts chapter 15. It's actually the only logical conclusion is that Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem conference, is covering issues and arguments that Gentiles and Jews were having. What should we keep and what should we not keep? Things that they all agreed upon was not on the table. What they disagreed upon was on the table. And circumcision is one of them. Physical circumcision. And Paul was teaching, again, according to the written Torah, that we don't see it as an explicit commandment to receive salvation as a human being. And how did Paul teach that? Let's go to the Torah here. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, in verse 16, it says, therefore circumcise the foreskin of your hearts, and be stiff-necked no longer. So here's the first mention of spiritual circumcision, circumcision of the heart. It's not just a new covenant, New Testament, idea or teaching. Again, the New Covenant is based upon the Old Covenant Scriptures. The Old Covenant Scriptures are our foundation. Christianity, the roots of Christianity is Judaism or Israelism, or being grafted into Israel, and the covenant is our foundation. It's a renewed covenant, like a remarriage. If there's been a divorce and you get remarried, doesn't mean you can just neglect the commandments of the previous marriage that regulate love and unity and faithfulness to each other. No, those commandments of faithfulness go into the next covenant as well, new covenant, as we call it. And that comes from Jeremiah 31, a new covenant too, prophesied. But Deuteronomy, or Devarim chapter 30, let's jump over to chapter 30 here. And in verse 6 it says, and the Creator, your Elohim, will circumcise your heart